with us. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. Before we really dive into things, we can introduce ourselves. We're here with Civic Software Foundation. It's a US-based nonprofit with a global network of collaborators. Our mission is to create technology and support applied practices that reinforce equity and democratic values. My name is Anjali Mehta. I am our Chief of Staff.
And my name is Gulshan Gular, and I'm the Director of Research and Learning.
I'd also like to give some artistic credit to Falah Khan, thanks to our beautiful backgrounds. And hopefully we can spark some new ideas today. So we'll have our full contact information at the end that you can make use of.
So today we want to start here. So we hope that something of our event description sparks some interest, and we hope that you have some understanding of the concept of open data, but also open movements. The good intentions and ineffectiveness in open data movement, the growing body of scholarship and debate over criticisms and solution-oriented innovations. So what do we intend to propose as remediation and why? Let's get into it. So what is open washing? I think it's a good point to start. We define open washing as publishing data for the sake of having evidence for data-driven decision-making, or creating a transparency agenda with no context around data or planned use cases, and with little to no consideration on its implications and embedded biases. To start, let's examine how open washing is mainly the effect of two well-intentioned but ineffective motivations for open data. The first part is the idea of transparency. So this idea within the open data movement has more often been presented as a one-stop shop fix. You can imagine the logic, look, our data is published on this public website, so we are transparent. Sometimes this even leads to considering one's organization as taking steps toward political and social accountability. We know for a host of other reasons that even if all the data on the world was published, it still won't provide a clear picture of what happens on the inside of an organization throughout data's life cycle, decisions around data, or how their practices serve. So we have transparency, and we have this data and technology determinism. The wider cultural connotation that data is objective and truthful and even inherently valuable. This has contributed to a larger phenomenon of data determinism and technological determinism. I'm sure you heard like, data shows us that, or data has a better idea. Data-driven decision-making, for instance, is a concept based on the curricular idea that the numbers are more accurate than anything qualitative. And because of this, the resulting actions are just the way things have to be. This understanding also feeds a real and palpable excitement to quantify every aspect of human experience and daily life, as if human beings can be fit into data sets. This over-reliance on and deep trust in data to understand issues and make decisions is a pernicious and cynical problem. Forces from pseudo-transparency and data determinism create a pernicious cycle that reinforces social injustices. To better understand the relationship between open washing and social justice and how these two forces create this cycle, let's look at it. So the cycle starts with data sets published and made open with no context around the decisions, motivations, or processes along the way. This is what we call open washing. This concept intentionally or unintentionally excludes data constituents, whom we define to be those represented in or impacted by a given data set. They are left out of this cycle. Data constituents become resources for data instead of key stakeholders. Then, giving no context around data sets and leaving data constituents out of the loop, obscures the biased nature of data. These data sets are then being used as pieces of evidence in the data-driven decision-making, in defining problems and agenda setting. Defining the wrong problem using biased data sets then cause unjust and biased resource allocation, causing real harm to oppressed and marginalized groups in society. Well, there is no real accountability around these decisions, and there is no requirement to be so. This leaves the questions that rise from unfair data implications unanswered. Then the logic of more data equals better understanding. If we can just collect just a bit more data, we'll understand what goes wrong, just leads to using data as a metrics for success or metrics for understanding the problems in this so-called data-driven decision-making process. And then this collected data with this understanding, again, published with no context around it, starting this cycle all over again.
So what Gulshan has been talking about is just a bird's eye view of a huge body of scholarship and research on the topic. But with this foundation, what we really want to get into is what actions we can take. How can we address the heart of this problem? How can we sustain the movement and create a bedrock for lasting change? Across the field, leaders have pretty resounding consensus, at least in theory, for a purpose-driven approach through new collaboration networks. You have think tanks like the GovLab at New York University and their associated Open Data Policy Lab expounding the idea of a third wave for open data. There's a lot more to be said about the first and second wave and how they define the third wave, but things to point out is that they identify in their publications are three major points. One, publishing data with purpose. Two, fostering new partnerships in that process. And three, prioritizing data rights. And they call out continuously a repeated focus on context. And I'll quote, "This latest iteration of the open data movement concerns itself with the technical, social, political, and economic context in which data is produced and consumed."
Are you going to Zumba?
This is resonant with arguments in data feminism, where the call for action is for context, but there's an acknowledgement also of not having the right incentives or networks to make it really happen. This book we're highlighting is from Catherine D'Ignacio at MIT and Lauren Klein at Emory. And I quote from their chapter titled, "The Numbers Don't Speak for Themselves," saying, "Governments and data providers have not invested as much time and resources in providing context to end users as they have in providing data. And data sheets for data sets are great, but can we expect individual people and small teams to conduct an in-depth background research project on a deadline and budget?" So we have come to conclude that the purpose of this purpose-driven approach is creating and valuing context.
Yeah.
And the new collaborative network needs to be established outside the current data lifecycle. So now we know what. The question really is who should act and how.
Now we're really getting into why we brought you all here today. Based on what Anjali has been saying, we can then define context as the situated knowledge in which a data set was produced and abstracted from through collection. In order to break this open washing cycle I explained earlier, with a specific regard to creating space for social justice, we need context. And as civic, we offer a methodology called structured context. Structured context is an applied methodology to remediate open washing effects with inclusionary practices. It is a technical metadata schema designed to address these two main critiques. To address pseudo-transparency, structured context focuses on commitment and trust. And to counteract data determinism, we put lived experiences of data constituents at the center throughout data lifecycle, capture what has fallen through the cracks of data categories. This quote from Howard Zinn reminds us once again why we need something more than data. It reads, "Statistical historians have tried to assess slavery by estimating how much money was spent on slaves for food and medical care. But can this describe the reality of slavery as to a human being who lived inside it? Can statistics record what it meant for families to be torn apart when a master or prophet sold a husband or a wife, a son or a daughter.
So given that definition of structured context, the collaboration that builds these inclusionary practices is recognized through iterative cycles engaging stakeholders and constituents that are both inside and outside the normal data lifecycle. Pictured here is a simplified form of Civic's infinity loop collaboration model, where we highlight that energy continuously flows through the system. We'll get into the different actors and stakeholders that catalyze this flow, but first, let me explain what type of context we mean in this model in terms of structured context. Based on the calls to action we are building from, there are two main buckets of context that we have identified for this collaboration model to focus on. So the right-hand side of the loop is foundational context. This is understanding and capturing the production of the data set. So essentially, this context is answering who collected the data, why they collected it, and how. The left side of the loop is transformational context, alluding to the cultural shift that can occur once this practice of structured context is in wider use. This context goes beyond the data lifecycle to capture the resonance of a particular data set. This is where we break ground on deeper situated knowledge and lived experiences. This means engaging with data constituents, as we defined as those represented in or impacted by the data set, as well as engaging with other domain experts to explore the social justice context, historical context, limitations, and use cases in regard to ethical governance. Specifically, we mean things like questioning the potential harm caused by a data set, the historical connotations for certain categories, and for which applications a data set is best used or not used for. I do recognize that the terms foundational and transformational may sound like this is a linear process that builds upon itself, but we really do mean a continuous cycle where the resulting contextual metadata is a living artifact of collaboration. Even though we don't have the people engaged detailed in this image, we can imagine how different people might interact here. For example, the researcher or program manager may have the background knowledge from their work on how a specific data set was created, but how does their contextual awareness change and deepen after seeing how an anthropologist or an historian or activist responds to that? A data scientist in a specific field may contribute to understanding methodology and have foresight into the impact from potential use cases. And in other scenarios, definitions and connotations of privacy change and evolve between different populations as you go through the cycle. So just some examples on how to think about the people given these two bodies of structured context. And to really explore how this ecosystem will function, we're going to discuss with you all. Our collective discussion will then lead us later to further engagement opportunities. So we will be splitting into breakout rooms in a minute and all be contributing to the same matrix on a shared board. So we first want to understand the different types of people involved. So we'll think of actors as those who will be involved in creating or contributing to context in some way. And we'll think of stakeholders as those individuals or groups who will benefit from this type of context being created and distributed. Though to be clear, we are not advocating for the actual data to be shared any further more publicly, just the resulting metadata. And I'll note that a single individual or single group could be an actor and a stakeholder, depending on their different motivations or jobs and activities. So we then want to understand how these different people relate to the different levels of context, foundational and transformational. And the stickies in the template are placed on who, what, and why. So almost off to the races. Through smaller group discussions of 5 to 6 people, let's imagine this data world where we are each civic agents connected to a larger community. Welcome back, everyone. It looked like the mural board was pretty active and a few conversations I joined were also active. So thank you for participating. Hopefully you can keep the conversation going and just want to see where this has brought us all. I think first, if you're still comfortable using your microphone and video, if you want, we welcome that. Just curious if doing this exercise while also seeing other people's thoughts or conversations at the same time made you think of anything differently, or this conversation isn't particularly new, but some of these angles and lenses that we're placing on it are any top of mind thoughts there, or in the chat. Feel free if you'd rather not speak.
I'd like to say a comment that is that even if maybe these conversations are not new, it still surprises me every time when you meet people who have this willingness to learn more and apply this to the job and say, okay, how can I do this? So this never gets old, no? Like meeting new people and kind of get a bit contagious of this motivation and this drive to move to a more positive note.
I would agree. That's why I'm so happy you're all here.
Actually, in our group, we were talking about trying to imagine situations where there would be stakeholders who would benefit from foundational context, but not from transformational concept, and vice versa.
Oh, interesting.
And so that we were, I don't know if we went to any conclusions, but we were just trying to think about, in understanding that differentiation that you guys are making, one would assume that there are situations where one or the other is more important. And so we're just asking ourselves that question.
Yeah. Anyone from the other group have a thought there? Did that come up for you? Or another question, the way these different actors and stakeholders interact, the matrix is a very, strict structure. Well, before we had been talking about this infinity loop model, which is very continuous and fluid. Neither of those is completely accurate of our reality, but any difficulties or thinking about those interactions in these two different models, or separating these ideas or combining them?
Well, I think, I was in the same group as Rajiv. I think sort of what we came eventually kind of concluded, I guess, if one can conclude anything definitively, is just that it's important, as much as it is important to make the creators of the data aware of like the need to collect foundational and transformational context, it is equally important to inform the stakeholders, like the people that are using the data, that both of these different contexts exist, because people may not be aware and they may not recognize the need for that. And an example that was brought up in our group was just around like stakeholders who care about, have a very specific agenda for why they're using the data, and don't really care, just don't really care as much about the different aspects of like why it was collected, like what effects it has. For example, when it comes to like reporting on performance or like sort of meeting certain financial benchmarks, for instance, it's kind of very dry information that is can sometimes be used without necessarily any kind of context.
Yeah, thank you. It's interesting because we can get more into it later, but a lot of the big questions that Civic Software Foundation is grappling with right now is, if you have this methodology for structured context, what is it, whether it's communication or presentation, that's going to make this technical metadata schema both valuable to practitioners, people using the data who want to have more conscious use, but also valuable to the public as a means of knowledge sharing. And those are two very different motivations, and bring up a lot of ideas there. We didn't talk too much about it, but another big piece of this collaboration model and recognizing stakeholders of context, transformational or foundational, and how some of the motivation might be more weighted towards one or the other, has a lot to do with the different power dynamics in our systems and society. Who is collecting data, who decides what's being collected, and why. And I wonder if this lens of power dynamics or uneven power dynamics cropped up into your mind at all, or was part of the conversation, or if it's bringing up new ideas now.
I would add a bit of spice in there actually, and asking like how then this relates to transparency and this pressure for organizations to be transparent, and this kind of almost theoretical transparency and accountability play going on. Because there's one side saying, well, data is what we need and you have to make it open. But on the other hand, there's this deep contextualization process that has to be created with different stakeholders and actors. So I would also I would like to hear what you guys think about it.
In our meeting, one of the things that came up in my mind was this idea of the people collecting the data, the people doing the analysis of the data, and how oftentimes those groups of people are not, non-white, and their experiences inform the ways in which they understand the data, and how it creates this dynamic of those who are studied and those who study them, this subject-object relationship that ends up being, I think, that ends up creating a lot of issues. So I was thinking about it in those terms also, beyond just, beyond what's on there.
Yeah, Thank you. There's a lot of thoughts there, I'm sure.
I think there's also a tendency to think that what's not so, if you call it scientific, is not relevant.
Yeah.
And so narrative and dialogue don't carry the same weight as facts and figures, if you will. At least that's the perception anyway, and that's part of white supremacy culture.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. It is a really important point that kind of underlies all this other work, is recognizing we started, with the situated knowledge that we want to bring awareness to, the lived experience, but that is, in your words and many other words, just the qualitative information or just the anecdotal, as opposed to something that is as relevant and truthful and important to take into awareness when anyone's using data, which I think is a good segue into the other things we want to share. So we'll keep going, but we'll have more time for conversation after these next new things.
Well, so we hope you enjoyed this workshop and this activity that we prepared for you. And to sum up our session, in the last hour, we first highlighted the problem of open washing, so we set the scene. And then secondly, we identified two main factors that was feeding into it. This identification step was important as it allowed us to bring visibility to the issue and have a clear understanding of the causes of open washing, which was namely pseudo-transparency and data determinism. We then introduced our intervention called structured context, a method centered around social justice and a clear move towards equity that is targeting the two main forces of this open washing cycle we looked into earlier. Lastly, we invited you to imagine a world where actors and stakeholders work together to create structured context collaboratively. We hope our activity sparked some new ideas and made you think about all the other possibilities that you were not aware of. We acknowledge that structured context will not bring the change alone. It's not just a one fix. It's not a checklist to go through. As we have seen in our discussion and your stickies on the board, this change requires various actors and stakeholders to actively participate, make commitments, normalize multiple narratives, and build trust. What we offer today is a place to start, an invitation to have a clear conversation, see the invisible and hidden, understand what has fallen through the cracks of data categories, ask questions, and demand accountability. This is the start of a long quest, and we hope you join us.
Yeah, so as we mentioned earlier, we're not the first ones to call out this need for attention and remediation through context, but we do have an actual practical application to implement this methodology for structured context, a way to really start these conversations and continue these conversations and bring visibility to the situated knowledge and lived experiences that data sets are abstracted from. So exciting news, Civic Software Foundation just launched a new program and call for participation in building the Civic Data Library of Context. This is going to be a novel public resource that will digitally host a full catalog of contextual metadata, all created through the inclusionary practices that we discussed around the infinity loop model. If any piece of today was interesting or sparked some ideas in you, I invite you to follow our website to learn more and find other ways to engage and contribute. We're looking for individuals who want to actively participate in grounding themselves in this new practice of creating structured context. And what's called the Emergent Lab is a place for applied learning and talent development. We're also looking for different organizations who share the values embodied by structured context and want to become implementation partners. Being an implementation partner from an organizational standpoint can include any or all of the following. So training for internal competencies, can be going through the applied process with us and publishing the resulting metadata in the library, or taking a step back and setting a foundational framework designed to empower teams and illuminate at a wider breadth than visible human work that goes into creating data ecosystems. Even though it's Open Data Week, I want to reiterate that none of this engagement includes sharing or publishing the actual data or making the case for sharing context data and shifting some of our efforts to this new form of structured context, all to remediate and bring different attention to some of the negative side effects of this open data movement. So more details on the website. It's now linked in the chat. And from here, I want to say thank you. We kept this to exactly an hour, but I think the time block was for an hour and a half, really because we want to be here to engage in this new idea with you. If you have time for questions, if you want to follow up on any of this, we're here. So either now or in our emails, we look forward to any of the follow-up conversations. Gulshan, anything else to add or open the floor to people? But again, thank you for joining us on this little journey today.
Yes, we do have a feedback form, which I will share the link just now. So if everyone would be willing to fill it in, it would mean a lot to us. So that's.
I have quick questions, scale of 1 to 5.
Yeah, and if there is anything else that you didn't have the chance to share or you thought about it but didn't know how to put into words, you can also have the opportunity to express it in a written form.
All right. Any last questions or open thoughts about these topics? I don't think anyone's ever mad on ending early on a high note. So we'll be here in case there's any questions, but thank you once again for joining us and participating. We look forward to all the other conversations that should hopefully follow.
Thank you. Great discussion.
Thank you.
I actually had a question.